All right, so now we come to the main part of our program, and I'll turn it over to Doug Hooker in just a moment. But I do want to highlight, just in the broader context, today's subject is about public education. It's going to be a theme that we're going to talk about probably 4 or 5 times through the coming year, in the context of our broader theme: investing for today, for tomorrow, today. So we have with us a thought leader who can help us understand what is going on currently with the public school system, the current snapshot, where there are points of pain, and ultimately how we can, as a club, maybe get involved with some transformative change, because that is some of the things we're looking at in this environment. How can we get involved and have an appropriate impact? So Doug, if you can join me on screen. Thank you very much for introducing our speaker today. I know you are on the executive committee of Learn4Life. And I actually counted, this is an organization that our club knows very well. I think we have 11 other club members who are also on the executive committee. So, so it's an important organization, and it's something that our club knows very well. So thank you for the introduction, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, President Cannon, and good afternoon, fellow Rotarians. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here this afternoon to introduce my friend, Dr. Ken Zeff. But before I do that, let me give you a little bit of background about Learn4Life. I'm sure many of you probably know what Learn4Life does, but you may not know the story of how it came about. In 2013 and 14, the Community Foundation, along with the Metro Atlanta Chamber, United Way for Greater Atlanta, and the Atlanta Regional Commission, along with Atlanta Icon and Kramer, were in conversations about what we could do as a collective group of institutions to help support the public education districts in our region. And we were searching for national models that we thought might be appropriate and relevant in the Atlanta context. And upon doing so, we came across a model, a collective impact model, that was started out of Cincinnati, the Cincinnati metropolitan area, called Strive. And over a course of, at that time, about 11 or 12 years, the Strive model definitely seemed to improve educational outcomes for the majority of children in the 3 school districts by state, by the way, 2 states that were involved in the program. And so we thought this may be a model that works here, but we don't know. Let's talk with some of our education leaders. And so we engaged in a course of conversation with 8 school districts, the 5 county school districts of Clayton, Cobb, DeKalb, Fulton, Gwinnett, as well as the 3 city districts of Atlanta, Decatur, and Marietta. And the 8 superintendents, first of all, acknowledged it was probably the first time they had been in a room together to talk about their common issues and challenges, and that they appreciated coming together. But they further acknowledged that they thought, after we explained the Strive model, that it might be one that would work, because it doesn't look to supplant or take the place of what they do in the classroom, but rather what the community can do in a collective and organized fashion to help them with the educational mission outside of the classroom. And with that, we launched our version of Strive, which we call Learn4Life, in 2016. And we recruited, were able to get on board Dennis Lockhart, who at the time was president of our Atlanta Federal Reserve, Sylvia Russell, who was then president of AT&T Georgia, and Dave Scheibel, who was CEO for Graphics Packaging. And they came on as our executive champions, being willing to help explain Learn4Life to the business community. We went about a search, and we came upon the perfect person to be our first executive director, and that was Dr. Ken Zeff. Now, each of you have seen Ken's bio. It was sent out to you, and if you haven't seen it, I'll just tell you real quickly. Ken started with a background in consulting with Deloitte, but he quickly pivoted toward education, where he later served as a policy development consultant for the U.S. Department of Education. He served with San Diego Public Schools, and when he came to Learn4Life, he came from us as having been the interim superintendent and chief strategy officer for the Fulton County school system. Ken has a background in economics, where he studied at Michigan, an MBA from Wharton, and a doctorate from Georgia State. So Ken brings a very good blend of a passion for children, a commitment and a deep understanding of public education and a keen analytical mind. And it was a perfect combination. And we have been served excellently by this gentleman as our leader. So with that, I'm going to shut up and I'm going to turn this over to our speaker today, Dr. Ken Zeff. Ken, take it away.
Thank you, Doug, for that warm introduction. It's always a pleasure to be with such great thought leaders on the other side of this call. You know, it feels really appropriate to be talking about public education on the passing of two civil rights icons, because public education, if we get that right, is really the road to social justice that those two men spent their lives advocating for. As Doug mentioned, Learn4Life has been around for a few years. The goal is really to find what's working in Metro Atlanta through a partnership of district leaders and higher ed leaders and business leaders. As Cannon mentioned, there's 11 folks that are on the other side of this call who engage in this work regularly. But the goal is to find what's working. How do we take it to scale? And through the course of that effort, we spend a lot of time studying public education in Metro Atlanta and have developed a pretty firm perspective on what it takes to move forward. So you have Cannon and Bill. Thank you for this opportunity to be here with Rotary today. They've laid out a pretty impressive group of speakers over the next few weeks to take you through different aspects of public education in Metro Atlanta. My job is to kind of set the table. I am sort of the leadoff hitter for those of you that still remember baseball. The idea, I will warn you, this is a little data-based presentation because I believe we all have opinions and data is truth. I know folks on this in this conversation are comfortable with data, and so hopefully you'll get a sense of, at least at a high level, where we are, where we're going, and in order to do that, we have to understand where we've been. And so we'll start with a little history. And so with that, let me begin to talk to you about the state of education, and let's dive in. So it starts with a graphic that, alas, I suspect many of you are familiar with. This is from the Brookings Institution that talks about how Metro Atlanta is faring with compared to the other 25 metro areas in the United States. As you see, job growth has been quite strong in Atlanta, but income growth trails every other metropolitan area in the country. It's a history of, and we'll get into the history of why in just a second. But if you are born poor in Atlanta, you are less likely to move into the move upper class than you are in any other city in America. The top 5% of earners in Metro Atlanta earn $300,000. That is 18 times higher than the bottom 20% that earns $16,000 a year. And that inequity is the largest that we see in the country. And so we understand that education is the great equalizer. Education is the way we lift families up, is the way we lift children up. And in Georgia, 1 out of every 2 tax dollars goes towards public education. 51% of the state budget goes towards public education. And we know there's this strong link between job growth and income growth and post-secondary completion. And so you see on the slide on the graphic on the right, Georgia is actually in the bottom third of post-secondary completion rates, and therefore the prosperity of our state and ultimately our region is greatly impacted. And we'll get into this in a second. But for those of you that have questions of whether or not public education matters, and I doubt those people still exist, but the data indicates that if you get public education right, that is your pathway to prosperity. That is your pathway to long-term growth. So let's begin by looking backwards. And you could pick the history up at a variety of points. And I will start at 1954 with Brown versus Board of Education. And let me also just preface this by saying, next week you'll be treated to Dr. Beverly Tatum, who is the former president of Spelman, also a Learn4Life Leadership Council member, who is a national expert on race and the impact on public education. So I will not get in the way of that conversation. I will just provide a quick overview. And in the coming weeks, I'm really impressed with the program Cannon and Bill have laid out for you to really dive into the different aspects. As folks know, in 1954, Brown versus Board of Education, the state of Georgia resisted integration. In 1955, the General Assembly at their next convening came back and said any district that chooses to integrate will lose funding. And so that further stalled progress until 1961, when the federal courts intervened, and we had the first integrated schools in the city of Atlanta. That's actually Murphy High School on the right there, which ended up becoming Crim High School many years later. Unfortunately, as Georgia dug in there, as the thought leaders of the time dug into segregation, resisted integration, they passed in 1964 freedom of choice, a policy facilitating white flight. And so the city folks left the city, left the city school system, and moved out into the suburbs. And then you fast forward to today, 2020, there are 18 public high schools in Atlanta public schools. 15 of them have 0 reported white students. There are only 3 students, or 3 schools rather, in Atlanta public schools that have any that are integrated, at all integrated. 15 of those schools are entirely Black. And that is a reflection of the community. Schools enroll who's in the community. But what folks need to understand, I know folks do, is that when white folks left the school system, they took with them not just their political and social capital, but their economic capital. And what was left was a school that was deprived of the resources it needed to be successful. So what is the impact of all of that today? So we're going to dive into that in a little bit of detail. So what is the state of education in Metro Atlanta? First, let's talk about what we mean by Metro Atlanta. When we talk about Metro Atlanta, we think about the 5-county region: Cobb, Gwinnett, Fulton, Clayton, and DeKalb, and the 8 school systems inside of that region. It's about 600,000 kids, about a third of the kids in the state of Georgia. About 10% additional kids go to private school, a little less, about 9% of kids in the region go to a private school, an independent school. And it's exciting that the region is growing. As you see from the data on the right here, we've added about 50,000 kids to Metro Atlanta in the last 7 or 8 years. That's a region that's growing and dynamic. That's exciting. The challenge is the kids coming in are traditionally harder to serve. They're traditionally, they come from homes with less resources, high limited English population. And so our educators and our school systems need to double down and get even more creative with less to continue to move kids forward. So how do we measure education performance? This is a very tricky question, and so we're going to unpack it in just a little bit of detail, and this I think will provide a lens for you as you get further into these conversations. So there's kind of 3 ways that people talk about measuring school performance, and I'll offer a 4th that we use at Learn4Life. The first is parent opinion. How do parents feel about the schools? So now if we were in a room together, I'd ask you, how do parents know school performance? And the first question that we'd ask is, what % of parents think their elementary age child is performing average or above average in school? If we were in the room together at Loudermilk, I'd do a little call and answer. I can't really hear anybody, but I'm going to assume that you say, 75, 80, 90, 50. According to a survey by Learning Forward, a nationally representative survey, about 90% of parents think their students are performing average or above average. So then the next question is, well, what is the actual number? Well, it's actually 50%, right? That's just data. Only 50% of kids can be performing average or above average. Then they ask parents, what % of parents think their child is performing at grade level in reading? In other words, can your child read at grade level? What % of parents thought that was the case? So 89% of parents thought that their child was reading at grade level. In actuality, the number is closer to 40%. Final question they asked was, what is your expectation that your child will get a post-secondary degree, be it a technical college or a 4-year institution? Folks have an idea? Think of the number in your head. What's the number? If you said 75%, you were right. 3/4 of parents think that their child will be earning a post-secondary degree, but the reality is only 26% do. Only about 1 out of 4 students actually complete their post-secondary work. So that is why that 50-point gap is the reason why just asking parents how schools are doing is fraught with challenges. We want parents to be engaged in public education. They need to have an active role, but just to ask parents, are your schools performing well? What we see is there's a strong bias to over-report, to over-recognize performance in public schools. Then another way you can look at it is student grades. How are students performing? That's a proxy for our kids' learning. So what we study done by New Teacher Project looked at thousands of classrooms across the country. And what they found was that in general, about 3/4 of kids are doing the work that teachers are asking them to do. They're turning in their projects on time, they're completing their work, they're generally earning A's and B's. The challenge was that only 17% of that work was actually to the rigor of state standards. So teachers were giving the work that was not as rigorous, not as challenging. Students were able to complete that work, and alas, not leaving well prepared because the grades were telling them they were doing well, although the work that they were doing was not up to what the state expected to be successful in beyond high school to post-secondary. So the last way that you often hear about is something called state level accountability. There's a program called the College Career Readiness Performance Index, CCRPI, which many on this call probably do not recognize, and that's okay. It is a state level system to measure how schools are performing. And as the AJC recently reported, CCRPI likely needs CPR. It's an index, and it's reweighted regularly. And so it's hard to get a firm understanding of where students are because the numbers and the algorithm changes. So over time, we don't have a good sense of how our students are performing because the math changes. So all that's to say is there's a couple of ways that we don't like to measure school performance, but at Learn4Life, and as Doug mentioned in the Strive model, there's really we look at 6 measures: kindergarten readiness, 3rd grade reading, 8th grade math, high school graduation, and post-secondary enrollment completion. I'm just gonna spend a second explaining why the research says these are great and appropriate measures to measure the quality of public education. So kindergarten readiness. Do students enter 0 to 5 when they come to school? Are they prepared to learn? Do they understand concepts of print? Can they sit in front of a teacher and be familiar and socialize and understand that teachers are there to learn, teach them, and they understand the benefits of learning by having some preparation before they get to school? 3rd grade reading, and there's been a lot of talk about this, and we're big proponents of children being able to read by 3rd grade. The research is very compelling. You're 4 times more likely to drop out of high school if you can't read by 3rd grade because the curriculum starts to leave you behind. 8th grade math is critical because that higher order work that you get in math in 8th grade prepares you for high school and ultimately into post-secondary. If you don't master those higher order concepts at the end of middle school, you're less likely to take more advanced courses, less likely to be successful at the next level. High school graduation, I think folks understand you need that diploma, that signal that you finished high school, that completion. Post-secondary enrollment, most jobs is 60% of jobs, and that number is growing, will need some sort of credential, not necessarily 4-year college, but technical college, some credential to be successful in college or in career and life. And finally, complete. If you haven't completed that credential, then you've taken up time, you've spent your money, but yet you haven't achieved that signal to employers that you're ready to take on a meaningful role in the workplace. So if that's the state, if that's how we look at public education, the next question is, how are we doing? And so I'm going to talk very briefly about each one of those items. So kindergarten readiness. There's about 250,000 kids and parents that are looking for a high quality early education slot in Metro Atlanta. As you see, about only 85%, there's only slots for 85% of those kids. So only 1/3 of kids right now have access to high quality early instruction. That number has been growing due to the good work of many folks in this conversation and the legislature. We've seen the number grow from 22 to 35, but you can see we still have a long way to go. 3rd grade reading proficiency. Again, it's the same story of the numbers are increasing. We are seeing a slight tick up over time, but as we peel back those numbers, what we see is there is about a 40-point gap between our economically disadvantaged and our students of means and our Black and Hispanic students and our white students. So even though we have seen a modest increase over the last few years, and that really is a theme, that the numbers are pointed in the right direction, but the achievement gaps remain, and the growth has been evenly distributed across subgroups. See something very similar for 8th grade math. 41% of students a few years ago, up to 45, and a similar pattern, about a 40% gap across subgroups. between our white students and their students of color, and similar between our economically disadvantaged and students of means. High school graduation is a bit of a success story. You see the numbers are much higher, 78 up to 81%. More students are walking the stage. And the gap is shrinking, only about 15-point gap between our students of color and our white students. And we can talk a little bit later in the Q&A what high school graduation means. We've done some things to help make high school graduation a little less rigorous than it was in the past, although we are excited to see more students walking the stage, because that is a critical path, a critical gatekeeper to long-term success. Post-secondary enrollment is also quite high. About 3/4 of students are enrolling in some sort of post-secondary program. That's encouraging. Again, smaller achievement gaps here, but where it really comes back down to earth is in post-secondary completion. Only about 29% of students in Metro Atlanta are finishing the post-secondary degree or credential that they set out to complete. About 1 out of 3 students are completing. And as you look at that by subgroups, what you really see is that it's really happened. This is persistence is what's happening after that first year. So you see most of the attrition happens even amongst our white students. Only half of our white students are completing after the first year. And it's even more devastating. Only 1/3 of our Black and Hispanic students are completing that first year. If you complete that first year, you're much likely to get to the finish line. But that first year, and that's really an indication that they weren't prepared for that first year, and that's where it really becomes an issue for students. So, I always like to, my dad likes to read mystery novels, and before he gets into it, he always likes to read the last chapter to see how it ends, to see if the story will hold his attention. And so the story in Metro Atlanta, I think it will hold your attention, because what you see is start to see an increase, and then unfortunately back down to earth, that 29% post-secondary rate completion. And so what the narrative becomes is that students are making progress slowly, but that post-secondary completion rate remains stubbornly low. And so this graphic, hopefully, if there's just a couple things you take out of this conversation, it's that there is no one silver bullet to public education. What you see here is folks pointing to each other, and you can start anywhere you want. You can start with the business community saying to, and I'm sure folks in this call have done that, pointed to college and to high school saying, you need to give us higher quality, more prepared employees and customers. And college and high school point to the middle school saying, look, you didn't see what kids came into my door. Kids were already so far behind when they came into my door. They were 3-4 years behind. I had to spend all this time catching up. And middle school and elementary says, well, look, it's not my fault. You didn't see what came in from kindergarten. Kids came in and they were totally unprepared for learning. They came from homes that didn't have the resources to prepare them for the educational process. And preschool points back to business and say, look, we need that tax base. We need that investment to get into that early care, to help get this cycle turning in the right direction. And what you see is, of course, no one's pointing towards themselves. Everyone's pointing towards somebody else. And the real challenge is, if we're going to fix this set of gears, we need to not just pick one item. We need to focus on all of these things and lift up all of these things at once. There is not one broken, leaky pipe in this pipeline. It's the whole pipeline that needs evaluation and support. So what do we do at Learn4Life? Doug mentioned this a little bit at the outset. We're a collaboration of the school districts in Metro Atlanta, higher ed leaders, business leaders, civic leaders, to come together, look at data, figure out what's happening, really build a deeper understanding, and then lift up those solutions that are working. Because there is a lot of stuff that's working in Metro Atlanta. There's a reason that we saw gains over the last few years, slow, steady gains. There is stuff that's working. But as I'm about to get into in just a second, COVID-19 puts all of those gains at risk. And so with that, let me pivot to the return to school. I imagine folks have been reading the papers lately. This is a hot topic, and our teachers and our educators are now on the front line of the return to normal from the pandemic. And so I want to just give you a brief overview of some of the challenges that districts are facing as they make very, very difficult decisions. I've been at this for 15 years, and I've never seen a more complex situation than we're experiencing right now. Folks remember on March 13th, the governor rightfully canceled school for the rest of the year and began this long process of unwinding in-person instruction. So what does that meant? Let's establish a couple basics. School closed for the last 9 weeks of the year, so in-person instruction was lost. Limited connectivity. What we learned when we went virtual is that many students didn't have devices, and students that did have devices, many did not have internet access. Wi-Fi connectivity became a huge barrier to instruction. Then you have this larger ecosystem. You have half of low-income parents did not experience some sort of either wage reduction or even job loss. Food insecurity was exposed. 1 out of 4 students in Metro Atlanta experienced some sort of food insecurity. I know this organization has been working doggedly to help reverse that trend. It's something that we've been living with for a while that got exposed during the pandemic. And of course, all of this, you're sailing into these budget cuts. Districts were asked to take an 11% budget cut in combination with all of these challenges. So we at Learn4Life, with our partners at Redefined Ed, wanted to understand what the impact of that lost instruction was in our students, because the state did not administer Georgia Milestones, which is the summative test to see how students are faring. What we found was more than 20,000 students in Metro Atlanta slipped out of that proficiency band into one of the lower bands. They were no longer on grade level. They were no longer on track for educational success because of the pandemic. And so that was really a gut punch to all of the work that educators have been making, all the progress that we've been experiencing over the last few years. Let me just show you what that looks like graphically. So this is in literacy, and you see there's been a modest gain of a few percentage points over the last few years because of the hard work of our educators and our larger community supporting the work of our school districts. COVID-19, what we call the COVID slide, basically erased about 1.5 years of progress, to kind of reset those gains over in the matter of a few months, really forcing us to begin to climb that mountain again. So now, what is the fundamental challenges as we talk about schools reopening? And even in the last few days, we've seen now almost all of the metro area districts have decided to begin school virtually. Gwinnett is the one district that has not made that determination yet. But the fundamental challenge is everybody wants kids to be in school. The challenge is, how do you keep kids safe and how do you keep kids learning? How do you balance those two, the tension between those two? So I want to provide a little bit of an overview of some of the challenges that districts are facing, understanding there's no easy answers. On a keep students safe side, do students wear masks? How do you manage transportation? How do you get the transportation systems in school districts are very efficient right now. If you're going to add more buses, you don't have buses, you don't have bus drivers to be able to accommodate that. You have to hire more personnel to do regular cleaning. Extracurricular activities, something that means a lot to us here in Atlanta. How do students participate in athletics? How do they participate in other extracurricular activities in a world where students are not supposed to be in close proximity? And this contingency closures issue is really befuddling. If you have one teacher that is exposed, is diagnosed, and has taught a class, does that whole class then have to be tested and wait 2 weeks? What about other kids that have come in contact? Do you close that whole classroom down? Do you close the school down? Do you close the district down? Those are questions that districts have had a hard time answering because there's no easy solutions. Then, of course, the other challenge of keeping kids learning. We saw digital equity is a huge issue. We think about 20% of kids never signed on during these last few months of the school year. How do we make sure there's an opportunity for those kids to be engaged in virtual learning? How do we replace the lost instructional time? Atlanta Public Schools has already reduced their calendar from 180 days to 170 days. How can we creatively think about getting more instructional time to students? Because we know that's essential, especially for our students who are further behind. We know students have experienced traumas, both seen and unseen. I mentioned before about the job loss, the general fear of getting sick. Kids will bring all that to their schools, and they haven't been around the adults over the past few months that are often their support systems in schools. How do we address that and prepare kids to learn? Our special needs students have been particularly hard hit. Many of them aren't in a position to learn remotely, and yet they've been compelled to be isolated from the very caregivers that help to make their experience and their learning more effective. And we have to understand through assessment where students are. So some emerging themes that we've seen so far. No one size solution fits all. There are some folks that are having they have two parents at home, that one parent can stay and manage the children. There's also single parent families where the caregiver is trying to provide a living and is also trying to be in charge of homeschool. That's very difficult, especially if you have young kids. As data changes, so have school plans. Just in the past week, we've seen a remarkable shift in how schools are approaching this. That's going to continue to happen because this situation is so new and the data comes out so regularly and pivots so quickly. I'd ask everybody that patience is required. Politicizing these decisions, these very difficult decisions that districts are making, is not helpful. Everybody wants kids to be in school. There's nobody on the other side of that issue, but we want to keep kids safe. And so understanding and having grace for our school leaders is essential. And just a reminder, this will not be cheap. There's estimates that it will cost several $100,000 per school to do the cleaning, to do the monitoring, to get digital devices in kids' hands. All that will cost money. And so we have to think about in this as legislation moves forward into Congress, as it inches forward, our school is going to be taken care of. And this is my last ask of you all, and then I look forward to engaging in some questions. I would be remiss if I didn't recognize the capacity and the power of the people who are engaged in this conversation as part of Rotary. How can you help? Something that Cannon asked us at the beginning. Well, here's a few ideas. Digital equity is becoming is not a nice to have; it's a need to have. It's as essential as having a textbook, having a reliable Wi-Fi, having a device so you can interact with your teacher. Supporting preschool in your place of business, we have to figure out a way to address this gap that we have, and there are some interesting ideas out there. But if you have the opportunity to provide that benefit to your parents, that could mean so much to them as they prepare their kids for public education. Think flexibly about parents with young kids, as in-person instruction is put off for at least a couple months. If you have young kids, you cannot likely leave them at home. And so parents are going to be faced with very, very difficult decisions. And finally, commit to programs and policies that support equitable public education. This can mean a lot of different things, and so I'll leave it broad, but understanding that the future of a prosperous Atlanta comes through public education. We must find a way to ensure that all of our children have an opportunity. We call it an achievement gap. It's really an opportunity gap. We must find a way to make sure all of our students have the opportunity to be successful, because it's not just a moral imperative, but these are the future of Metro Atlanta, not quite literally. And so we must find a way to bring those students along and give them the opportunities that many of us have had. And so with that, I'd like to invite Doug to help me to engage in this conversation with you all. I put some contact information up there if anybody wants to follow up with Learn4Life and get a little bit more detail, because this was a very quick flyover of the state of education in Metro Atlanta.
Indeed it was. Indeed it was. And thank you, Ken, because you always do a great job, even in a very short time, conveying a lot of good and thoughtful content for us to consider. I've got a bunch of questions here. And for those of you who are not aware, there is a question box at the bottom of your screen. Just go ahead and type your question there. It'll be sent and made its way to me, and I'll try to get as many in as possible. So, Ken, here's the first one. And I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative to change it, because the question says, what 3 things do APS and Dr. Lisa Herring have to get right this year? Well, I don't want you to pick on APS and single them out. Education is as much a regional issue as so many other things we deal with. So let me ask you to broaden that. What 1, 2, or 3 things that you think our public school systems have to get right this year or do well in order to begin to help children recover from our current situation?
Well, I appreciate that question, and it's something that that question evolves over time because the situation is rapidly evolving. I think distance learning in the spring was more like emergency learning. It was just trying to get through. Teachers were not prepared. We had when I was in Fulton County, we had something called Snowmageddon, which was 2 or 3 days where there was this big outage, and we thought we'd never see anything like that in our lifetime. This has been since March 13th. There's been an unprecedented use of the word unprecedented.
Right.
Districts have to figure out ways to get distance learning better. I think there's been a lot of exposed. I'm a parent of three Atlanta public school students. There are multiple systems that districts are using that to connect with students. They have to simplify that for parents, and they have to provide content for teachers, because teachers are not prepared necessarily to work in this environment. So I'd say distance learning is one. This budget issue is dogged. I actually believe the state budget crisis is probably lagging a little bit. And so districts were able to, a few have announced furloughs for this year, but mainly they're able to exist in rainy day funds. I think next year is going to be the real challenge. And so figuring out how to do everything address all the challenges we just named with fewer dollars is going to be a real challenge. And the last thing I would say is just the trauma that students are facing. We just don't know. We just don't know what students are up against, and so we're in a rush to get kids back up to their learning, to get back up to grade level, and we have to figure out how to unpack their trauma and make sure that they are prepared for learning, because if kids' brains are so clouded with everything that we read in the papers and all the news that we hear, it's going to be hard for them to get learning.
And so let me take that question and flip it around in a bit, because you did a good point of pointing out a number of things that we can do to help as citizens who aren't necessarily directly involved in education. But what one thing or two things you think we can do to help our public school systems this year in this situation?
So I think there's a long list of things that I think districts need right now. I think digital equity is primary. I think that we have found that Wi-Fi probably needs to be a universal utility that everybody experiences. We would never shut off kids' water, kids' electricity. If we expect kids to learn when they're at home, we have to figure out a way to get connectivity done at scale, and that's really a solution that's better done at scale than individually. That's one piece. I think figuring out how to create space for parents, because parents now, I saw one meme that if you really want to get people to wear face masks, remind them that they're going to homeschool their kids for the next few months if they don't. And so figuring out how to, as employers and leaders in this community, figuring out how to create space, and still, demand, our businesses need to keep going. But if figuring out how to create space for parents and supports for parents who are now tasked with being that primary instructor for their kid, because remember, K-12 has been the de facto childcare system in our country. Well, that's now not an option. So figuring out how to creating space for parents, I think, would be really vital.
And that triggers up or tees up another question we have here from the audience, and that is, what other services should be provided by schools to help with overall social mobility? If as you say, we believe that education is one of the primary vehicles, are there other services that schools should be providing or should be assisted with to help overall social mobility?
I love the last addition that you made with assisted, because we've asked our schools to do a lot more than
way
we ever
too
have in the
much.
past.
Right.
They're now, we just saw over the last 2 months, they're the food service provider. They're the community hub. They provide all of these special education services that never had to provide in the past. So where I like what you said is the assisted piece. And I think authentic business partnerships with schools have not always been there, and I think in part school districts are not well organized to provide that avenues for businesses. But I think if there's a number of things I would pick on. One thing that we've discovered is in that transition between high school and post-secondary. I'll bore you with just an inch of data. The ratio of counselors to students is supposed to be about 250 to 1. So for every counselor, there should be 250 students. And in actuality, it's 450 to 1 because of the state budget. And so students need help navigating from high school into post-secondary, because they right now they get about 22 minutes per student with a counselor during the year. So if there's tons of opportunities for businesses to be engaged in creating those pathways, and Georgia's technical college system is terrific. If businesses can be engaged with high schoolers, providing them internships, providing them real world experiences, to get them through that, especially our first generation students, that would be an enormous help, because our schools aren't going to be able to commit more resources to preparing kids for post-secondary, and that we know that's essential for the long-term prosperity of both our students and our region.
Right. One last question, and then we're going to have to close down and turn it back over to President Cannon. And it is, do you think that the negatives of school closures, things such as the lack of direct instruction, access to food, social supports, do you think that outweighs the risk of potentially incurring COVID in the school environment?
That is a great question. Are there easier ones? That gives you go down the list. Look, that's the question, right? That's what I try to describe the difficult decision of keeping kids safe and keeping kids learning. I'm a parent of 3 kids, and we got to keep our kids safe. You know, we have to provide direct, strong intervention to make sure the spread doesn't get out of control. And so I believe that if in this context, that the decision that I think most districts have made is that if we can double down and really reverse the trend, we can get back to in-person instruction. There's nobody that's on the side that believes in-person instruction is less valuable for kids than distance learning. But right now, with the spike that we're seeing, I understand the difficult decisions schools have made, and I think we're going to, because I think the real question is, what's the quickest way to get kids back for meaningful in-person instruction? And I think most districts have made the decision, the quickest way to do that is to keep kids home for another couple months, and then we can get kids back. And I hope that, and we're seeing that across the country, by the way. That's not just Metro Atlanta, that's Los Angeles, that's San Diego. This difficult decision that district leaders are making is because we want to keep kids safe. And I hope that history will judge us well. And the last thing I'll say on that topic is, let's have grace and patience for our district leaders. Nobody wants to be in this space, and reasonable people can disagree. But to suggest that there's anything but the best interests of kids at heart, I think I have not seen any evidence of that, and I actually believe that doesn't help. And I think the leaders on this call, the great men and women that lead Atlanta, can really help model this conversation about supporting our education leaders, both at higher ed and at K-12, into getting us to a place we need to do, which is a prosperous Atlanta for everybody.
Amen. Amen. And I will close us now with this one thought. Congressman John Lewis was known to say that nothing can stop the power of a committed and determined people to make change in their society. And I think Learn4Life and your leadership and the partnership of the school leaders represents that effort by this community to try to make meaningful change. And we know it's not a short-term thing, it's a long-term play. So your point of, we need to have grace and patience and persistence is critically important. So with that, we'll close it off. Thank you, Rotarians. Thank you, Ken. And we'll turn it back over to President Cannon.